Okay, so I wasn't sure what I wanted to talk about in my next AuthorTube video, but then one of my top 10 of all time YouTubers, and definitely my top study tuber, boofed up. So the adorable Jack Edwards, which if you haven't checked out his channel, go ahead and do that now. I'll wait. Okay, are you back? Okay. So Jack is in his final year of study at university, which in England requires something called a dissertation. For those of you who don't know, a dissertation is a monstrosity of a research project. I mean, it is 12,000 words of curated, cultivated information, and with 1 week left on the deadline, he had written nada. To be fair, Jack fully recognized how much he had messed up, and with all of the quarantine stuff going on, really, it's not that surprising that some things got left till later than they should, but and a dissertation, that's not some cute little side project. This isn't like a Camp NaNoWriMo challenge. This is your academic future. So anyways, because apparently even people who should know better can still somehow fail at outlining and properly planning to construct a paper, I thought that might be something worth going over. Whether it's a 12,000 word dissertation, a first-time novel, a short story, or a 3-paragraph response for your English homework, they all should follow the same pattern. So we're going to review, and for those of you who don't know, I guess learn, but we're going to review how to outline and plan for a major writing assignment. So step 1 for any big writing project, whether you're doing a novel or a dissertation, or if you're putting together a big thing for work, is figuring out your deadline. Now, if it's for school or work, you've probably been given a deadline. Go ahead and bump that up a day. You don't want to be freaking out at 0 hour because something went wrong. Give yourself the breathing room. Just give it a little bump. If it's due on Friday, it's due Thursday now. If you're doing it for yourself, it's a little bit different. Like if you're working on your own book, or if it's, I don't know, you just felt like writing 12,000 words on ancient Greece for some reason. You don't have a given deadline, but I would strongly advise that you give yourself a deadline. This can be a little tricky. You need to be realistic about what it is that you're trying to accomplish, how much time you have to devote to it, and how long it's going to take you. It could take you a week to do research. It could take you 10 minutes. It kind of depends on the project. But having a deadline is a very useful tool, because as we go through the rest of the steps for how to sort of tackle a writing project and plan it out, it's going to be very important to plan things out in chunks. Aiming for some far off maybe is not as effective as aiming for June 1st or 90 days from now, or heck, even 6 months from now. Depends on what you're working on. But having that sort of line in the sand where you need to aim for, it helps. Step 2 for any big writing project is doing the research. Now, I can already hear some of the author tubers going, oh, but I'm writing fiction. There's nothing to look up. It's all from in my own head. Okay, first of all, that's still research. You may call it something else, but that's still research. Figuring out the facts of what you're doing is research. If you've decided that the world that your book is taking place in uses a multi-tiered parliamentary system of government, or if there's no government, or if they're in space, there are things you're going to need to know. You're going to need to know how fast a spaceship travels. You might need to know how much saffron is worth in gold in the 12th century. I don't know what you're writing. But there will be things that you need to know. That counts as research, even if it's just from your own head. For the rest of you, research isn't made up. It has to come from somewhere else. And the problem with that is not necessarily the research itself. Doing research is actually not that hard. The problem is figuring out what to do with it once you have it. Having 1 million saved web pages is not helpful. Having 27 bookmarked websites, also not going to be great. Picking out 6 books from the library with a bunch of post-it notes in the sides, maybe, but it's still a lot to go through. Figure out what you're going to do with it before you start researching. Whether that's post-it notes or an outline is up to you, but the system I like the best is actually one that Jack Edwards uses, and it's what he used on his dissertation. It's part of why he was able to write a 12,000 word dissertation in less than a week. I don't recommend that. Don't do that. For those of you who don't know, annotations is a fancy word for writing notes on the sides of things. That's all it is. If your teacher ever wants you to annotate a book, just write notes in the margin. When you annotate for research, you sort of might put in why you clipped this. Like if I have 17 different websites and I copy and pasted a paragraph from something, why did I copy and paste that? What was this paragraph for? Oh, right, because it connected this thing with this other thing. Okay, yeah, I got that. All right, no problem. Having that information there, all in one place, is a huge resource. And it's something that you can go through later on when we get to the next step. For fiction writers, this might seem kind of similar to you to the jot bin pants method of outlining. Anytime you would come up with sort of the rough outline for a scene or even a whole scene, it's kind of like your research stage. You are finding facts or tidbits or bits of the story. They don't have context yet, they don't belong anywhere yet, but they're pieces of the story or pieces of information that you're going to use later on. All right, dealing with any kind of big project, whether it's fiction, nonfiction, academic, work-related, once you have your research, you need to outline. I know some authors don't like outlining, and those are usually the authors that have a hard time once they get about midway. Yes, sometimes you create an outline for a project and then your characters just wander off and do whatever. It's kind of like The Sims. Like, no, I made you to be a doctor. Why are you going off and flirting with the surfer? You have 3 children at home. What are you doing, Veronica? What is happening? I spend way too much time on The Sims. Anyways, what was I talking about? Outlining. When you're outlining, because you've already taken all of your research and you have it in that table, you literally just have to figure out where you're going to be using these different bits of research. You don't need to assign specific sections or chapters yet. In fact, I recommend you don't. But you do need to group things together. Does anyone remember that thing that we all had to do in the 4th grade where you had like your main idea and then you had little bubbles? Yeah, do that. Because you can put the bubbles in order later. Right now, you just need to get them bubbled. Get the stuff that you're going to need together all in one space. This is not a zero draft. It's not. For those of you unfamiliar with the term zero draft, it's something that Kate Kavanaugh uses quite frequently when explaining sort of the just put words on a page. Sometimes they're great words and you're going to keep them. Sometimes they're terrible words and you're going to have to completely redo them. But this is not a zero draft for one very important reason. Zero drafts are largely uninformed. They don't usually have an outline in front of them. They are literally just fly by the seat of their pants. This also isn't a first draft because a first draft has real sentences and this doesn't have real sentences. This has something resembling sentences, but not exactly. We're going to call this a half draft. A half draft is you taking the organized research and putting it into a sequence. You're turning those bullet points into sentences. They don't have to be great sentences. They should make sense, but if you get stuck, there's absolutely nothing wrong in keeping one of the bullet points, put it in a different color, or use the highlighter tool to make sure that it stands out. You can go back to it later, but A half draft is taking the research that you've already conducted and turning it into something that resembles an actual argument or an actual story. As opposed to just scenes and facts, you have something that informs you a little bit about what's happening. Another reason why we're calling this a half draft is because you might turn in a first draft in a pinch. Don't ever turn in a half draft. This is something that you would never, ever, ever, even under the worst of circumstances, consider handing in. This is a mutant, a halfway step between the outline and an actual draft. Now you have to deal with that half draft. Step 5 is actually going through the process of creating your first draft. And yes, I'm still calling it a first draft, even though you sort of did a draft before, because that one doesn't count. That one was a crude monstrosity of a being that we're just going to pretend didn't happen. One of the things that Neil Gaiman says is that the process of creating your second draft is making it look like you knew what you were doing all along. Make it look like you knew what you were doing. Take that half draft of mostly coherent sentences and the occasional highlighted bullet points and craft it. Turn it into something that you are legitimately proud of. And that's your first draft. One of the key things to consider when you're doing your first draft is that depending on how long you've been working on this project, you need to take the time to walk away from the half draft before you start the first draft. You cannot go directly from one to the other. You need to give your brain a chance to think over all that you've been processing, and more importantly, to see the words on the page for what they are instead of for what you thought they were. That's a really common thing that a lot of people have trouble with when they're writing essays or when they're editing. They know what the story is in their heads. And the fact that the words on the computer screen don't match that. Step 6 is fine-tuning that first draft into, if not a finished product, then an almost finished product. But like when you stepped between the half draft and the full first draft, you need to walk away. Except now it can't just be for 30 minutes or an hour or 3 hours. In between your first draft and your edited draft, you need to walk away for at least a full 24 hours. If it's a longer project, I would say a week. Because you need that perspective to be able to look over what you've created and recognize whether or not it's complete garbage. I know that sounds harsh, but it's true. Sometimes you write something and you think, this is the greatest sentence that has ever been crafted. I'm a genius. And then you come back a week later and you go, holy, what was I on? That doesn't even make sense. Okay, less caffeine for me. You need to give yourself a chance to reset, a chance to look at this with fresh eyes. Final step, step 7. This is your final edit. Now, I know you did a half draft and a first draft, and then you did an edit. Why do you need to do another one? But just trust me on this one. It really is worth taking that time to do a final read through, especially if you've already poured so much effort into your writing. Try printing it out too. That makes a difference. Seeing it on a screen versus seeing it on pages are two very different things. So sometimes in order to be able to catch silly mistakes or missed punctuation or just a sentence in the middle of nowhere that doesn't make any sense, you really need to print it out. And again, just like between your first draft and your edit, you really need to give this final edit a little time to percolate. It really will make a big difference in the final product. And that's it. Those are the 7 steps to tackling any big sort of writing project. Hopefully this has been helpful and you'll actually remember these steps so the next time you have a large assignment. Don't leave your writing until the last minute. In this area, don't be a jack. In every other area, be a jack. Be honest, be kind, be supportive of those around you, and always put your best foot forward. Seriously, if you haven't checked out Jack Edwards' channel, go give him a look, okay? Just maybe don't save your dissertation for the last week.